Hello and welcome to today's Contourl webinar, Information Governance 101. First, for some housekeeping items. Today's presentation will be recorded. This recording will be shared with you via email tomorrow. At the end of today's presentation, we'll show a list of upcoming complimentary webinars. If you or any colleagues are interested in joining future sessions, please visit us at contourl.com and select the Events tab to register. We'll also share white papers, blog posts, and articles we've recently published. We invite you to complete our brief post-event survey. We truly value and appreciate your feedback. If you have any follow-up questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to us at info@contourl.com. And now allow me to introduce today's speakers, Tom Miles, COO of Contourl, and Mark Diamond, Contourl President and CEO.
Thank you very much, Chloe. Today we're going to talk about Information Governance 101, and we're going to do it a little bit differently. We could try and, present this as the traditional life cycle, or we could, there's a whole bunch of different information governance models and frameworks out there, none of which are really used that much or industry standard, and quite frankly, it can be very confusing. Today we're going to try and sort of talk about what are some of the things that you need to look at for information governance. What is it trying to achieve? How do you do it? And when you do it, how does that help? And we're going to attempt to be as plain spoken as possible. Joining me on that is Tom Mile. Tom, welcome.
Hi, everybody. Good to be here today.
Tom Mile is Chief Operating Officer for Contourl. He spends the better part of his week helping organizations really develop, implement, and execute information governance programs. A former litigator. I'm Mark Diamond. I'm CEO of Contourl. And many of you have been on our webinars before, but you already know this. So we're an independent provider. We don't sell any products. We don't store any documents. We don't do any reactive e-discovery. And so we may well talk about different vendors or products out there. It's not because we're trying to sell you. It's just because we see it used quite a bit and have an opinion on that. So we are really independent out there. And so I'm going to probably start with what a lot of organizations already know or already feel, which is that there's a lot of challenges managing information out there. There's record retention requirements. And really, we're seeing lots of organizations with lots of records needs. And quite frankly, they're sort of meeting the minimum, but in most organizations, we're seeing significant over-retention of information, well past what the records retention schedule says, well past what business value is. And so a lot of clutter out there. A lot of records programs and to some extent information governance programs focus exclusively on how long do we keep stuff, the retention period. But it's more than that. It also has to do with privacy, intellectual property, and sensitive information. What can we do to both identify, classify, and protect that information, both to meet rules for data minimization, as well as to be able to ensure that we're good data stewards and we're protecting our information. Part of it goes all the way out to sharing. How do we share information? How do we make sure that if we're having information that we can share with whom we want and not share with those we don't? And oftentimes this is very closely linked to information security because, as we all know, a lot of the breaches happen from information that was improperly shared. It doesn't end there. We also, many organizations feel the pain of e-discovery and legal holds, whether it's from litigation or regulatory inquiries out there. At the same time, when we have all this overabundance of information, you have so much clutter, you can't find anything. We're finding employee productivity and collaboration is really impacted. And that really impacts, and we'll talk about this a little too, but also AI governance. Increasingly, we're seeing AI is becoming a player, or I should say information governance is becoming a player in terms of enabling the use of generative AI. So it's a little bit more complicated. And because we have all these drivers, it stalls a lot of organizations out. We'll just walk through a few of them. The world is changing. It used to be just records management, but now it's about data minimization and how those sometimes conflict with records requirements. Tom, walk us through this a little bit.
Well, if you're coming to information governance from a privacy perspective, you are probably familiar with hearing about data retention policies, and they have been largely developed over the past couple of years in order to cover dealing with how to manage personal information and what retention needs to be for personal information. Oftentimes, those policies unintentionally and sometimes without anybody knowing about it conflict with your actual records retention policy and schedule. Your privacy team sets something up. They say, here's how long it needs to be kept. They may then show that to the records team who says, oh, wait a minute, this doesn't match what our retention periods are. Or sometimes they don't even show it to the records team. And so you have employees who are confused about which to follow. That can be a big issue. And as we'll talk about, we really very much prefer combining these and to have it in one place where you're dealing with retention requirements in one location rather than enforcement by multiple regimes within your organization.
So we have record retention rules, we have data minimization with privacy, with e-discovery needs. One of the needs that a lot of organizations don't think about is the use of generative AI. And that is actually, in our view, quickly becoming a fairly significant driver. And there's two aspects of AI. First of all, we have records retention requirements and other governance requirements in using AI, and that's certainly true. But also we have fairly significant need for good data quality, which is driven by information governance. And let me talk a little bit about what I mean. If you're using something like ChatGPT, you are going to depend upon the training data that the large language model, OpenAI or Gemini or Google Gemini or Anthropic Claude uses. And when these large language models train their models, which is they feed it all the data and they create a bunch of tokens on there so they can figure out what comes next when you ask a question. A lot of this is just sort of common stuff off the web. And, in the aggregate, it sometimes can be pretty useful. But sometimes not. Sometimes the responses you get from these large language models just using, again, the off-the-shelf training data isn't really sufficient. And let me give a specific example. If you go to ChatGPT and you say, create me an image of a wristwatch with the time at 1:01, ChatGPT is going to come back and say, okay, here you go. Here's a wristwatch. The time says 1:01. And you're like, no, you get that wrong. You get the date says 1:01. I want the little hand, on the one and the big hand on one. ChatGPT, can you please redo this picture? And ChatGPT goes, oh, very nice. I'm sorry, I'll get that for you. And they come back, here you go. Here's the correct picture. And you're like, no, it's not. I mean, it still says it's 1:56, and I want you to put it 1:01. This is just a marketing example, but there are other similar issues, regardless of which way you're using, in engineering and finance and life science, however, sciences, other things like that. What's going on here is that the vast majority of images of wristwatches that these large language models have trained upon are using sort of catalog pictures off websites for wristwatches. And if I'm selling a wristwatch, having the time at 1:56 is the sexiest way to display and sell your wristwatch. And because there's a dearth of good images, or all the images that it do get tend to be very similar, our somewhat ignorant large language model just doesn't get it. This is where using off-the-shelf data can be an issue for organization. So what organizations are doing is they're using generative AI in a more advanced ways. They're using something called retrieval augmented generation. And in this case, they're saying, okay, ChatGPT, I want you to create an image of a wristwatch, but I don't want you to use, your standard training data. I'm going to give you a bunch of images of wristwatches. And I want you to use my images as an example when coming up with the result. And you could use this if you're doing wristwatches. If you're doing life sciences out there, we're seeing a lot of organizations that will have tremendous amount of, clinical data that, they large stores of clinical data, which is actually very good data. If you're doing contracts, you have lots of examples of good contracts. You're not dependent on whatever contract you happen to find on the web. If you're doing finance, I mean, in every industry, there's all these examples where if you have good data and you can feed generative AI good data, you're going to get much better results. However, here's the issue. If we use generative AI to be able to train it, how do we know if we use our own data? How do we know we're giving it good data? Because we have good data and bad data. We have clinical trials that worked and some that didn't. And maybe we want to specify the tune, but maybe we have old contracts. We don't want to use those clauses. We want to use new contracts. How do we make sure that we also don't inadvertently give it sensitive data? Hey, that's a trade secret. I don't mean to give that to some third-party large language model to build my query on. Even if it was out there looking and it found the stuff, I didn't realize it was out there. What we're seeing out there is that one of the drivers for sort of the later adoption use of generative AI is to use this process called retrieval augmented generation, RAG, and feed it the data. How do we make sure we have a good data? That's an information governance problem. That really is an information governance problem. And we're seeing a number of organizations really taking a look and saying, hey, we've got to get serious about information governance because we have lots of good data we want to use, but buried amongst that, we have lots of bad or poor quality data that we don't want to use. And this is very strategic for us. So we want to be able to do that. So again, I'm going to put all these different areas together, all the needs. And this is why we're seeing maybe traditional records programs that are growing up and becoming larger information governance programs. And again, our attempt here is to be a little bit more plain spoken on what's engaged with a records management program. And we're going to go through some of this at a high level and then walk through in some specific examples. A lot of organizations, when they start out their information governance journey or updating their program, they're doing assessment and strategy. Hey, what's our current maturity? Where do we need to be at? How do we benchmark that? They're updating their records management policy to be modern. Tom alluded to this. We'll talk about this, to be privacy enabled with personal information. They're looking at their processes and governance. They're looking at their data security classification policies and their privacy. And I talked about a little bit of AI readiness, how that fits into there, and records and governance processes, and also using for M&A and data integration. Next step is they're beginning to automate that, saying, hey, we want to do good automation and training. We're going to look at managing emails and files and automating those. We're going to look at behavior change management. Maybe we're going to be looking at structured data. Maybe we're going to clean up the old stuff. That's going to be a very important part of it. And then on an ongoing basis, we're going to refresh the policies and audit them. And once we do that, hand in hand with that, we've got to get the right organizational approach. We got to get, this is not just a legal project. This is not just a records project. This is not just, one team. In almost every organization that we work with that are doing successful information governance program, it's a cross-functional team of people descending oftentimes all the way into the business units with coordinators to be able to do that. And your steps may vary. You may not need to do all of these things. And there may be some things in here that are not on this list. But again, when we talk about doing information governance, we really talk about doing these steps and being able to maintain it. So again, our goal here is to be plain spoken. By the way, if you have questions, happy to pose your questions. We've got time in that. Tom, talk us a little bit. Let's jump into sort of when you're doing assessment and strategy. Why do you want to sort of figure out your maturity?
Well, that's because every organization looks at information governance in a different way. If you are a highly regulated financial services company or a life sciences company, you're going to have to take a different, more stringent approach to information governance than if you have very little, if you're a nonprofit with very little regulatory oversight. So you want to look at what is the right level of maturity for your organization. A lot of companies come in with the thought of, I want the biggest and the best. I want the Ferrari. I want the sports car, the luxury car of a fully optimized a fully optimized program. But we find that those tend to be, if you want to make sure that you're not overmatching what you need from a maturity standpoint. If your regulatory environment only requires a trusty Chevy, something that doesn't have to go into the shop very often and can get you far enough along, then maybe that's really where you need to be. We generally recommend that you be a little bit higher than a golf course model. We think that full capacity really is where most organizations need to be. We see that most organizations in general want to be slightly better than average, slightly better than what the norm should be. And so we recommend and encourage you to take a look at what do we really need to have, because that influences how you approach those steps that Mark was just showing. Some organizations may need to do a lot more to accomplish that, to get to that level of maturity, and some will necessarily not have to do that much because the maturity will be of a lesser amount.
So Tom, this is an actual example from a client. Walk us through what kind of things they're looking at.
Well, these are examples of the types of things in an information governance program that you want to think about. What is the status of your policy and schedule? What kind of processes and procedures do you have around information governance? Do you train your employees? Do you have an organizational structure? How do you manage the different types of information in your organization? Paper, unstructured data, email, those types of things. How is information security, privacy, risk, litigation readiness, how is that addressed in your organization? This represents the maturity model that we have, but there are multiple maturity models out there. But what we have tried to do here is to show, here's where you should be. That dark blue is the recommended state. You'll notice that very few of them, none of them get to 5, and very few of them get above 4, if we think of 5 as being the Ferrari and 4 as being the trusty Chevy. But you can also compare yourself against what your peers are like. You can say, all right, go out and look at what others in your industry are doing. Sometimes when you're trying to sell an initiative or convince leadership that you need to implement information governance, being able to show here's what other organizations are doing can actually be a good selling point to do that. And being able to show how their maturity may be actually ahead of yours is an even better selling point.
One of the questions I hear, or comments I hear from organizations beginning to delve into this area out there, and they want to go out and they feel overwhelmed. You're a big advocate of creating a roadmap. I mean, do you really need a roadmap, or just do it, or what works?
No, you 100% need a roadmap, and you need to be thinking about this in terms of there is not an easy button for information governance. Depending on where you are in your journey, there is not an easy button. You'll notice that this particular roadmap here takes place over 2.5 years. Some organizations take longer than that. And this, even though realizing that this can be a long period of time, this can help to reduce the overwhelm. This can help to break things down into bite-sized pieces. Let's take the things that we know we need to do. If we're assessing where you are today and we're saying, all right, here's where we are today. Here are the things we need to do to get to the maturity level we want. Break that down into pieces and say, all right, step number 1 is going to take 3 months to do. Step number 2 is going to take 3 months. Can we do it in the same area? Some of these others we need to push out into future times. We want to make sure that we have something that is doable, and being able to say, let's just try and boil the ocean all at once and develop a program within 3 to 6 months is not sustainable. You want to develop something that shows we're making constant progress, but that realizing that it isn't something that can be built overnight.
We have a question here. Do you have a recommendation for IT maturity model assessment tools or questionnaires, healthcare specific, general? Well, yes and no. So there is no industry standard regulatory framework for information governance. Or ISO has something, but not really. There are some models out there that are just, one is so complicated. It's this wagon wheel with all these pieces. I don't understand it. I mean, and I do this for a living, or I have a very hard time walking somebody through explaining it. Our preference out there is and we're a little biased on this because we helped them write it, but we actually do think it's one of the better ones. This Association of Corporate Counsel has a maturity model, and email us and we can send you a copy of that out there. But whatever model you do, what you really want to do is a couple attributes that we're looking for. A lot of the models focus internally. What, is my program staffed the right way, or do people like my program, or other things like that? We don't think those questions are really relevant. We think more relevant is what's the impact of our activities on what we're trying to achieve. Are we really reducing risk? Are we managing files? Are we managing emails? Are we helping AI? Good maturity models need to focus on real world impacts, and not on sort of these, there's this feeling that if I make this in the framework and I make it complicated, somehow that's going to have more authority. No, all you're going to do is confuse people. And we've seen many a program go down with the wrong approach like that. Be as impactful in real world as possible is our opinion on that. So, and again, happy to talk more about that. But as you can say, we have a lot of opinions on that. Thank you for that question. We are a big believer in not trying to do this by yourself. If you're legal or records or IT or InfoSec or compliance, true information governance programs are really run very well by engaging a number of other stakeholders. And the reason is that there are wins for everybody in this, and there are tasks that really need to be done by a different group. Despite the claim that organizations are creating chief information governance officers that have responsibility for all parts of it, we're just not seeing that happen. Instead, what we're seeing is the most typical way is that you may get a director of information governance or a manager of information governance that works with a cross-functional steering committee, that works with legal and that works with IT and that works with AI and that works with all these different groups to be able to coordinate them together, and synchronize the activities that have common work streams out there. If you try, and our other recommendation is get in with those groups early, and even at the assessment level, very much so, to be able to engage them, to be part of it. So we don't think you want to try this alone, because it gets much more difficult, even if it's more effort initially engaging a larger cross-functional team, but those tend to be much more successful. Tom, talk us, so moving along, we're seeing organizations take a more modern approach. What are they doing and why?
Well, it's interesting. We've been talking about modern record schedules for a while, and I'm still seeing schedules from organizations that are very much rooted in kind of a past approach to schedules. We think, and some of this should go without saying, but I'll go through all of it. A modern record retention schedule is comprehensive. It is across all media. It's not just your paper. It's not just your electronic. It's not just what records might be in email. It's anything that might be considered a business record that has a retention requirement. You want to make sure that you're capturing both the typical records that you would get, your finance, your HR, your legal records, but also your operational records as well. We've seen a lot of schedules in the past that only were based on records that had legal requirements to them. But we want to make sure that we have those legal and regulatory requirements, but we also want to make sure that the schedule includes records that are identified by business value. I would argue that probably 60% of the records on a schedule have no legal requirements or more, but they are of value to the business and they need to be included in the schedule. I've seen many retention schedules that say, no, we don't consider those to be records. They need to be records, because otherwise you're going to let that information be retained basically forever. And we want to try to be more responsible about that. We want to address, as we've talked before, personal information and address how the retention for that may differ from the other retention periods. We want to have a compliance portion of it. Are you auditing it? Are you making sure that everything is in compliance? That makes it defensible. And then, as Mark mentioned before, a good schedule will help you when you're dealing with generative AI, because it's helping you keep the right information the right amount of time. I know there's a question in here about poor quality data. One of the things that makes it poor quality is it's outdated records. It's records that you don't want to train an AI on because they're so out of date, they don't reflect company position anymore. But if they're still hanging around, you don't have a choice. So let's put them in your schedule. Let's make sure that you're deleting them when you're supposed to, and that drives better quality data.
Well, and maybe we get to that. I'll set you up for this, the question there. I'll ask the question, and then we'll go through this, and then we'll see if we do the slide. What makes poor quality data and information governance? I know that there's something called a Web Information Quality Assessment, which appears to have disappeared by 2017. Basically, are there definitions of quality? Now, segueing on that, Tom, you're saying that we want to define in the schedule not only legal and regulatory requirements, but also business value. Why?
Well, for the reason that I mentioned before, which is probably 60% of the records you have in a schedule have business value, but not legal requirements. I worked with a law firm once that was representing one of our clients, and they took the position that, well, we need to think about all of these records that have legal requirements. There needs to be a separate line for each one of those. But for everything that has business value, let's just call it a non-record and let them keep it as long as they want to keep it. That leads to all sorts of issues and all sorts of problems. Your schedule needs to include both. You need to talk about not just the legal requirements, but also here's what has value. But even records that have value have a time limit on them. They're only valuable to the company for so long. So let's define that period of time, and let's make sure we set it, because otherwise you're going to engage in a lot of over retention unnecessarily. And even though there's no legal requirements behind them, over retaining information that has business value still carries a lot of risk.
And I guess I'll add to that. We look at a records retention policy and schedules as much as a legal document as a consensus document. Let's get an agreement with everybody. What has value? What do we want to save? What doesn't have value? What do we want to get rid of? And the extent that we can do that initially in the records retention schedule, that's going to make execution for all the things that we talked about so much easier versus only having legal and regulatory requirements and having does this have business value again and again and again. And going back to the question of what makes poor data quality, that's really something we want to drive a consensus with the business units on. Hey, is this useful? I mean, so we need to save stuff that we have to for the legal and regulatory requirements, but we also want to save stuff that, hey, how do we use this? Does this help us run the business? Is this information we need to save? Is there a way this information will help us drive generative AI? And this is something you have to work through. There's no like standard you can apply. It's a discussion, and that's going to vary from organization to organization. And the final thing I'll add to this, and this is going to sound very counterintuitive, there may be some of you that says, hey, we have significant over-retention. The last thing I want to do is jump in a conversation about what has business value, because I feel like we'll go off the deep end on that. Organizations that have sane conversations on what really has business value and do this the right way, even including business value in the records retention schedule, have much less over retention, much less information clutter than those that don't. And for the simple reason is if we can get a reasonable consensus on what we need to save, it's going to be much easier to execute. And therefore, we're going to have a lot less data. And so again, I have this discussion quite often with general counsels and CIOs to saying, hey, let's take a smart approach to it.
Let me add real quick. Let me add real quick to the answer to that question about bad data. There's much more to this, and data quality is an issue that is not a topic of this conversation. But the one thing that we think about that makes bad data is we call it rot. It's redundant, obsolete, and trivial information. Multiple copies, records that have expired, trivial information that doesn't belong there. That's where you can start thinking about bad data. That's just one place to start. There's more to the answer to that, but that makes up a large percentage of what you have that I would consider to be bad data.
And I'm going to sneak in an additional question here real quickly. Our company has multiple copies of records in both electronic and paper. How do you know who has the gold copy? So what can be destroyed? For example, somebody from IP told me that he has copies of contracts he works on, but wasn't sure if he could destroy them and assume the contracts and copy team. That's a great question, and that's a long question. I'll start it out and then give it to Tom. Generally, that's not an issue in the records retention schedule. The records retention schedule should define what you want to save, and then your execution steps that we're going to go in a little bit is going to say where you want to save. And part of that process is defining the system of record, the copy of record, the one place, a place for everything and everything in its place. We want one copy of stuff, and that really comes down to the execution and then the cleanup. And Tom, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Only thing I would add is you definitely want to identify an owner for your information, because it's completely permissible for others in the company to keep copies of things, but they need to know when they have a copy or when they're in charge of it. And so that gold standard or the gold copy, you need to identify who the office of record is for that information. Probably doesn't go, like Mark said, in a schedule, but it needs to be identified, because you'll need to know who needs to be managing this. Make sure you're keeping it make sure they're keeping it appropriately.
Well, and the one other thing I'll add to that is we find a lot of times, not a lot of times, sometimes employees over-retain because they thought those were the rules. They thought I thought when I came here, we were told we have to save this. So they'll be saving 12 years worth of documents based on, misperception of what the policy is. So a lot of times it comes down to an education issue. All right, Tom, we alluded this earlier. We got the records retention rules that say we got to keep stuff for a minimum period of time. We've got the data retention privacy rules that say you can't keep it too long. How do we synchronize those?
Right. So the best way to do it, and I'm not going to spend as much time on this slide as on the next slide, but I mentioned before that we really think that that data retention policy that your privacy team may have created, retention policy and schedule that your records team may have created, really need to be harmonized. They have much of the same information. They contain legal and regulatory requirements. They talk a little bit about business value, more the schedule than the data retention policy. They're going to talk about what records contain personal information. They both have that. They have disposition requirements oftentimes. And we want to make sure, though, that we also include that legitimate business purpose, because the fact of the matter is, and Mark, do we have it on the next slide? The fact of the matter is that you want to make sure that you are. I get a lot of questions. Oops, we don't have it on the next slide. So go back to real quick. Let me just cover this real quick. I get a lot of questions to say, how long do we keep personal information? Which is not exactly the right question. The question is, how can we justify the retention period in our schedule to be able to keep the personal information as long as we need it for the purpose for which we collected it? So that legitimate business purpose. So part of why you want to combine those together is to be able to say, if someone comes to you with a request for to delete their information, or a regulator comes to you, you're able to say, here's why we keep this permanently, even though that's a really long time for personal information. Here's the legal reason why we have to do that, or here's why we might keep your information a little bit longer than you want us to. Being able to justify that's an important thing to do, and you can't really do that just in the context of a data retention policy. You really need to make sure that you're combining both of these so that they are included and they don't cause confusion throughout your organization.
Interesting how when we started talking, it sounded like information governance was just sort of records management. But as we go farther along, you'll see it's more comprehensive than that. And this is a good example of that. I will add, we have another question. Some members of the organization refuse or are afraid to discard anything. How do you convince them differently? Well, this is really a behavior change management exercise, and we're going to get to that in a little bit. But it's a couple things. First of all, let's get that consensus at the policy level on what we want to save or not save. And that really comes to discussing with people. The other one is we sometimes call it a hunting license. Sometimes employees, we had one company, insurance company once we worked with, where they kept the backup tapes, was it 25 or 30 years?
Okay.
And they thought, well, those are the rules. No, those are the rules. We said, no, actually, we know the rules. There's this records management folklore that, oh, we've got to save it. And so sometimes this goes back to training, saying, no, either it's expired, you don't need to keep it, or perhaps, you're not the custodian, this is just a copy, you don't need to keep it. Or better yet, we'll get to this, let's not even have that decision. Let's make it an automated disposition. All right, Tom, organizations think of, I got to keep files and emails and paper and database data, but there's more to it. There's other things we have to think about saving or not saving.
That's right. There's a lot of things that are in your organization that don't really make their way into documents. Those are chats. Those are messages. We're talking about generative AI now. We're talking about prompts and the outputs of prompts. How do you manage that? The way to think about it is really the same way that you might think of all of your information and all the records is that most cases chats don't really have any value beyond the short term. We only want to keep them a short period of time. Posts and messages in Teams and Slack and other collaboration tools might have some working value to them, but they really aren't records, and you don't want to consider them as records. Ephemeral messaging, we see a lot of companies starting to use ephemeral messaging, which can be records, but it might require an archive tool to actually capture those, because the very definition of ephemeral means they're going away. But we're also seeing, with all the rise of collaboration tools, we're seeing tons of meeting minutes. We're seeing lots of recordings these days, lots of transcripts, lots of notes. You want to be able to keep that, and the system of record is where they need to be. And then finally, with generative AI, the prompts themselves may not have value for a long period of time, but the output may actually have value for longer. So the message here is that all of this information are relatively new formats that we really haven't seen until the last 5 or 6 years, probably. You need to have a process and a plan for dealing with them, both in the short term. Let's get rid of things as quickly as possible, but let's also keep the working information we need to keep. And if it is a record, let's make sure it's in the right system and keep it the right amount of time.
So moving along, again, we've talked about the assessment, we've talked about the records policy, management policy. Now we're going to processes and governance, and a big part of this is having a data security classification standard. What sensitive information do you have? This could include privacy, intellectual property, trade secrets. There's a wide variety of that, and what is our policy for how we manage and control it? This is different than an information security policy. And information security is how do we specifically protect our systems from people breaking in internally, externally. This is really how do we classify our data? And so about half the time we have clients that actually have a pretty good data security classification policy. Half the time this does need some updating. But the idea is you're going to see a theme here. We want, just like we did with the records retention policy and schedule, we want to make the data security classification comprehensive. We want to use it as an input. So when we go configure our systems and configure our automation, hey, this is how and where we can manage it and how and where we can store it. And so this is just a sample. And I should mention the chart that we showed on the last slide was just a sample. Your mileage may very well vary. But really updating the data security classification standard is a big part of it. And then Tom, the processes and procedures, and there's different things out there. What are the processes, procedures organizations need to look at?
Well, this is really about how does an information governance program get managed? How do you manage the day-to-day operations? Because this is not necessarily something that you can just set and forget, that you can create it and turn it over and it just runs itself. These are, many organizations, there is a dedicated department and staff and team members. Some organizations handle it differently. We'll talk about that more in just a little bit. But you need to have the day-to-day processes. If somebody wants to make a change to the schedule of the policy, how do you manage that? What happens if you have a merger or an acquisition or you're closing down a site? How do we manage the integration or de-integration of information from those types of things? We want to do a cleanup periodically. How do we instruct the employees how to do that? Our employees are leaving the organization. How do we deal with their information so that we make sure that we are capturing all the important stuff that they had and that it's not going to get deleted within 30 days of leaving like most IT departments do? There are just a number of things that don't always get thought about or don't always get managed because there's never been a records function at the organization. You've got to have the how to do a lot of these things in order to run the program on a day-to-day basis.
We have one follow-up question here, which is, you mentioned that there's no standards. How about for Canada? No, I think the same thing applies. We work with a number of Canadian companies, and we haven't. There are legal and regulatory requirements clearly in Canada, but we're not aware of any record information governance framework that is specific or widely used in Canada. Again, the ACC model is global model. So that would be probably your best one. All right. So we've been through assessment. We've talked about policies. We've talked about processes. Now let's get to execution. And we all know this. Having, it's worse to have a policy you don't follow versus no policy whatsoever. And I've had people come to me saying, good, that means I don't have a policy. No, it actually means you have to execute your policy. When we're executing this, we're going to make a couple arguments. The first thing we're going to say is we're not yet at the point where information can be automatically recognized. Using machine learning or DLP can capture some of the stuff, but not other stuff. And if you want to talk to me offline, I'm happy to go through that. To some extent, at least for unstructured data, emails, files, other things like that, we have to have some level of human participation, of employee participation. Now, if we want employees to do this, we have to make it drop dead simple and quick. And it has to follow something called the 5-second rule. And the 5-second rule basically means that everything an employee needs to do, look it up what the requirements are, tag it, pull down, apply labels, move it, put it in any metadata, everything they need to do, and not just for records retention, for data security classification, for legal hold, access controls, all these have to happen in 5 seconds or less. And to do that, we really have to be able to automate things. And so a large part of implementing an information governance program is automating. Now, we're going to use Microsoft 365 here as an example, just because it seems like most of the greater universe is going to Microsoft 365. But a quick note, there are other repositories out there, and not everything can or should live in Microsoft 365. You have other things like contract lifecycle management systems. But for the illustration here, what we want to do is teach Microsoft 365 all the rules. We set up some teams and SharePoint sites. And here we have an employee that has tax records or journal records. And okay, suppose this finance employee has a journal record. He will put it in the journal record SharePoint site. And when it lands there, we will have taught SharePoint to apply a 7-year retention label. We'll have taught it to automatically apply the correct sensitivity label. We'll have automatically the right access control in there. When the information is put there, the system automatically does the tagging. The system does the classification and the governance of it moving forward. And the idea of dragging and dropping it, that can happen in 5 seconds. Now here's just a sample of one employee's view. Now there are other SharePoint and Teams and OneDrive sites in the department, and other departments have other, there's a variety of what these look like, but generally this is what most organizations are doing for a best practice to be able to automate this and to make this really drop dead simple. And then this actually tags on to the other question that was asked a minute ago. Once we have it in the right repository, and by the way, we can implement legal hold, so we won't prematurely delete something, won't spoliate something that we need to preserve. But suppose I save something in my SharePoint site on April 9th, 2026 with a 7-year retention. In 2033 or 7 years from now, it will wake up and say, oh, this was put here on April 9th, exactly 7 years ago, no legal hold, time to automatically delete it. We often look at one of the maturity levels of a program is how well have you implemented automatic deletion. Now, we have to obviously have to have a good legal hold process that comes into this. We have to have it something that we monitor, and it kind of freaks some people out. I mean, we have that, but in general, we're seeing this is really a best practice, and we see lots of organizations, big and small, using this type of approach. And Tom, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
Nope.
So the other thing I want to add in here too is and I'm just going to go through this briefly. We're going to be doing a seminar on this in the near future, but a next execution step is how does information governance impact AI readiness? And we always like to break down AI into 6 different levels of adoption, everything from ChatGPT to Copilot to using existing tools that have AI built into them, to connecting to your AI data, to integrating or using agentic AI. And different groups are at different levels on this. But as you can see from the chart here, and again, we're just touching on this today, information governance has a tremendous impact on AI readiness, whether it's having data security classification policies implemented to make sure that we're not oversharing information, that we're protected, to making sure that we're working with our privacy rules, to making sure that we have good data quality so that we're implementing and saving the right stuff and getting rid of the low quality stuff. So when we feed AI our data, I talked about that, we're doing that the right way, or full governance. It's interesting. We really believe that use of generative AI is really driving the demand for true information governance, because information governance really allows organizations to use generative AI very successfully. And so again, you'll see more on this. I'm just touching on this, but this is a huge driver. Tom, let's get to that next part of it, which is the behavior change management on it. And you are not an advocate of sort of dictating to employees what to do, but rather approaching them with a more positive message.
That's right. And this comes a little bit to the question that came a little bit earlier, which is how to get employees to feel empowered to delete information. Part of it is by understanding what their pain is, to understand the issues that they have. A lot of organizations, people are keeping everything forever, and it's resulting in problems. They have trouble finding information. They don't know how to go and find. I get a lot of things that say, I know how to find my own documents, but if I need something else, I need to go to somebody else to have that. That's a symptom of some pain that can be fixed with all of this. Figuring out what the pain is a good way towards going towards getting acceptance, because let's figure out how to solve your pain. This is going to solve the issue that you have. We're going to make you more productive. We're going to make it easier for you to find information so that part of your day isn't spent just looking for things. Once you can solve the what's in it for me part of it, then the rest of it, we find that most organizations, employees tend to be rule followers. They want to follow the rules, but they've never had the rules to follow. So by putting the rules in place, but also telling them, here's how you can benefit from them, that is just kind of the first step to really good change management and acceptance.
I oftentimes have an initial conversation with the senior stakeholders, maybe the GC or the CIO, and they say, hey, we're announcing this huge data deletion project because we have over retention of data. And I said, that's fantastic. There's 50 to 70% of your data, if you're like a lot of organizations like you, that can and should be deleted compliantly. However, don't call it a data deletion project. What it's really about is identifying the high value information, making that information accessible. And as the picture here shows of the person looking in the garage, is addressing the clutter. Let's get rid of the clutter and focus on the high value. Now, we're doing the same thing. We're still getting rid of a lot of stuff, but how you position it is a tremendous impact on how successful. And Tom, walk us through just this is part of a larger behavior change management.
Well, this is part of changing the paradigm. This is part of changing I'm going to save everything everywhere. And really what's interesting is that people start thinking of information as their information, when really it's not. It's the company, it's the organization's information. So the change management process is designed to move over from that thinking to, we're going to store information only in the right places. We're going to make sure we're keeping the right information. I like to call this the Goldilocks rule. We're going to store the right information for the right amount of time in the right place. That's something that makes sense to people, because they probably know that we're keeping stuff all over the place right now. It's not sustainable. How do we get it all in order? People need to also be aware of their responsibilities. I have a responsibility to keep information as long as it needs to be kept, but then I need to make sure, to the extent that it's on me, to make sure that that gets deleted and disposed of appropriately. There's been historically a lack of understanding of responsibilities or consequences for not following your record policy. That the change management process really helps with that, to make sure that there is that awareness. We find that to get to that desired state is really where you need to be, and it's about convincing them that this is actually a good place that they need to be. And frankly, given the pain that we're seeing in most organizations, it's not as hard as you think it might be.
And then, you know, having a foundation of doing the training, and Tom, you alluded to this, having good training to explain to people.
Right. So you want to be able to train them basically on information governance. What's a record? What do we need to keep? What are the things that we actually need to keep? Because I have so many companies who their employees are like, I don't even know what's a record and what's not a record in my organization. Is that copy a record? It's a copy of a document that should be kept. Do I need to keep it? But also, the one thing that we don't see enough of is training on what's a non-record. What are the things that I don't have to keep? What do I have permission to get rid of? What are the things that can go away? Very few policies that I see tell people you may dispose of non-records as soon as you no longer need them. That makes up a huge percentage of the rot that I talked about earlier. But just having training on the basics of this, what's a record, what's not a record, what can I keep, what do I need to get rid of, or what do I need to keep and what can I get rid of, goes a long way to helping people start to understand what good retention culture looks like in an organization.
And you don't have to be the bad guy or bad woman. This is really an employee productivity benefit. You know, and this goes without saying, but also to check this. Sometimes it's like, I'm done with this. I've given them the policy and I'm just going to turn away. And that's not helpful. I mean, we really need to audit where it's working. Where do people get it? Where do they not get it? Why do they not get it? How do we measure whether we're being successful? And a lot of this stuff can be done programmatically. When do we refresh this? You know, good policy and schedule is updated every year or two. We don't like, we think a perpetual update of policy and schedule introduces risk and non-compliance. It's really, we're seeing a lot of organizations sometimes get going, and then we have to remind them, hey, let's keep it going and let's keep this alive, because, you know, things change and things drift a little bit out there. Now, we have a question in there out there, which I was waiting on. Which function does the RIM lead normally sit? Is it legal, IT, or other? So again, we're going to say usually there's a steering committee. It's the whole program is not owned by one, but a cross-functional steering committee with a number of different stakeholders. Where does the RIM lead sit? Well, the RIM lead, or the information governance lead, is often, sometimes it's in legal, sometimes it's in IT, sometimes it's compliance. But more important is that they're not just worried about legal or compliance or IT issues. They're really, hey, how do we orchestrate all these different stakeholders and all these work streams to get the desired result? And how do we make sure we're doing it the right way? How do we wake up every day? So I'm probably not going to get, legal people want me to say it's in IT people want me to say it's in compliance people want me to say it's in legal, and I will probably not make anybody happy with my statement, but it varies. So one of the things we want to also focus on is, how do we make this compliant, legal, and defensible? And one of the mistakes organizations make is they're stressed out about this, so they create this they hire a law firm that creates this super detailed long policy with all of the legal citations in there, somehow thinking a court or regulator will think that is more compliant. No. Yeah, they will look at what your policy said. What did you say you're going to do? They're going to look at that. But more important, they're going to say, how did you do it? What are your technologies? What are your processes? What are your training programs? How did you do, what were your file plans? What was, your employee to be able to do that? And then they're going to say, how well did you check up on this? What was your audit like? What was your surveillance and reporting? What were the updates? And so it's all of these three things together that give you compliance and defensibility. Now, the good news is we don't need to be perfect. These are inherently imperfect processes, and the courts and regulators want reasonable, good faith efforts. If we try hard, we check our work, we fix things when they don't look right, you are going to go a long way in terms of being defensible. The big mistake that organizations make is that they're waiting for the perfect policy or the perfect process, and they can't quite get it because they never will. And then they wait and they don't implement. And so I'd rather see you get to good today and improve over time than really trying to push something to wait for perfect and never do anything, because that's, quite frankly, well-intended is actually the most risky way of being able to approach that. I'm checking to see if we have any other questions here. So we got a few coming up. I'm going to briefly go through some things about Contoral. We are the largest independent provider of information governance, AI governance, and privacy consulting services. And so we work with 30% of the Fortune 500, plus quite a few small, mid-sized enterprises, lots of nonprofits, lots of public sector organizations out there. And we do assessments and roadmaps and policies and schedules and the automation strategies that we talked about and the training strategies. We have a fairly robust set of services out there, from a roadmap and policy all the way through. And likewise, one thing we want to offer is that maybe you're seeing value in this. We do a virtual in-house information governance seminar. Now, this is a seminar that we do virtually, and it's presented just to your company or just to your organization. It's exclusively for you. It's about an hour, and we're going to talk about some of the things that we talked about here. It's a little bit more of a seminar-like format with back and forth interaction. And organizations use this as a way to be able to, hey, I'm interested in this, but I want to get my other stakeholders involved. I want to get my senior management and team involved and understanding this. This is a great tool for sort of being able to do that. Email us at info@contoral.com. We can even offer CLE credit for this for one state. And again, this is not a vendor pitch. This is not us selling Contoral. We really try and exclude that during the virtual in-house seminar. And we don't charge you for it. It's easy for us to do. We do a whole lot of them. And even if you have, no intention of ever using Contoral, don't worry. It's easy for us to do. We're happy to be able to present this. And so email will be able to do that. And we're also starting this week peer exchanges. So this is where we're getting our clients together, and we sometimes invite other guests to be able to include on this. And this is a chance for industry-specific groups of stakeholders to talk about what they're doing. This is one of the times where we're not talking a lot. We're just sitting there listening to our clients talk amongst themselves. And so these are actually coming up next week. If you're interested in this, you see something out there, let us know, email us, we'll be able to do that. And likewise, we've got a couple webinars coming up. We've got a real-world data deletion seminar coming up next month that we're really looking for. And we alluded to this earlier. We're using AI for everything. What are the steps to get ready? And so that will be our June Contoral webinar. And again, register for that at contoral.com. Okay, and then likewise, we have lots of white papers, articles, other information on there. The astute listener will realize we've glossed over a tremendous amount of information. Go to our website, or if you just want to email us, info@contoral, hey, can you just send me this information? We're happy to be able to do that for you. And finally, we have a post-webinar survey after the webinar. Take a minute and answer that. I mean, what did you like about it, and what did you not like? What did you think you were going to get? What did we miss? What do you want us to talk about? We actually pay a lot of attention to that. We want to make this very useful. And so both positive and negative comments. What can we do better? Please take a minute to fill that out. That's very important to us. Okay, we have a question, almost out of time, but we got a few questions coming up. We are getting ready for technical implementation of a document management system. When would be an optimal time we wanted to discuss this for policies and processes? Sometimes there's a tendency to want to delay that. We always think that earlier is better for a couple reasons. Earlier to engage a larger group of stakeholders. You don't want to have one group does this and get halfway through the program strategy and then pull everybody else in and say, by the way, this is what they're doing, because human nature is going to say, oh, that's what you're doing. That's not what we're doing. I mean, you've got this half-baked. Likewise, you want to make sure that you can get involved early in the process to get making sure we're looking at the right issues. We're focusing on the right stuff. We don't want any redos. Tom, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
Well, no, I would say if you are if you are getting ready to implement a technical system, you want to make sure that it's probably a good idea to start talking about what the governance of that looks like beforehand, because the last thing you want to do is retrofit. The last thing you want to do is go back in and change anything because maybe the best practices aren't being followed in what you've got there. So I would say that usually before anybody implements something, you want to make sure that you have all the right decisions made so that you're just implementing it once and not multiple times.
With that, I think we are officially out of time. Hey, I want to thank everybody. Some fantastic questions, some great interaction. We very much appreciate it. Thank you, Tom, for sharing your information governance wisdom with us. And we wish you success as you start, roll out, implement, build out, refine, and make excellent an information governance program. Good luck.
Thank you again to Tom and Mark for today's interactive and informative webinar, and thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar on May 19th, Real World Data Deletion Strategies.